people used to think, there's lots of symmetric clusters in nature because somehow symmetry gives you some advantage. We're saying actually it's simpler. It turns out that if you remember that you're searching in the space of the algorithms rather than search in the space of shapes, then you're much more likely to make something symmetric than something that's not symmetric. And what we see, what we then basically, we show this in some theoretical models, then we show it for real proteins, and for RNA, and for every other molecules. And this explains patterns of nature extremely nicely without having to worry about natural selection at all. It's not that natural selection isn't working, it's just that the reason for the symmetry is not natural selection, but the fact that symmetric things are easier to make. So it's as simple as that.
I'm Brandon Vaidyanathan, and this is Beauty at Work, a podcast about how beauty shapes our world and the work that we do. In this season, we're looking at beauty in science. All right, well, hello everyone, and thanks for joining us. My guest today is Professor Ard Louis from the University of Oxford, where he is a professor of theoretical physics and leads an interdisciplinary research group that studies problems on the border between chemistry, physics, and biology. Ard was born in the Netherlands, raised in Gabon, and received his first degree from the University of Utrecht and his PhD in theoretical physics from Cornell University. And prior to teaching at Oxford, he taught theoretical chemistry at the University of Cambridge. Ard, thanks so much for being with us, for joining us. It's such a pleasure to have you here.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's my pleasure to be here.
Great. Well, tell us a little bit about your background to get started. What drew you to science in the first place, and then perhaps physics?
It's interesting, and I think back to my earliest memories. I've always wanted to kind of figure things out or find things out. I've always found knowledge interesting. As a child who liked to read encyclopedias. My parents are both scientists, so I obviously picked something up from them, and I really enjoyed that. I lived in Gabon in Central Africa in the jungle, so a very remote area. We had a pit chimpanzee. You had to drive half a day to the nearest shop kind of thing. So it was very much in the middle of nowhere. And the forests there are absolutely spectacularly beautiful. So I found that interesting. Obviously, my father was he studies the jungle. So I was watching him study this. And so that probably played a role. I still remember first learning about physics in secondary school and finding that particularly exciting. It was more the precision of that you could understand using mathematics, something very detailed and accurately about the natural world. I found that very exciting, kind of fun. So I've loved physics since I first encountered it in secondary school and kind of wanted to study it ever since. And I'm been extremely fortunate that I now get paid money to think about physics. But I would probably be doing it anyway even if I wasn't.
That's fantastic. So why physics and not, say, biology or something? Given that you're struck by the beauty of the jungle, and what was it about physics that perhaps you found beautiful?
Yeah, it's a good question. Obviously in our family, that's a question that's been asked many times. Apparently, I don't remember this. My parents said that at some point when I was about 15, I sat them down and said, Mom and Dad, I have something to tell you that you're not going to be very happy about, and I think you should know. Of course, every parent of a teenager gets slightly nervous at this point. And apparently what I said is, I've decided I'm going to be a physicist, not a biologist. So at some point, apparently then I had already decided I wasn't going to do that. Part of that, I think, is because the way biology was taught was as a kind of set of facts. Like, who's here a bunch of relatively unrelated facts, learn these 50 words, but there was no kind of conceptual map that you were given. It was just like memorization, as far as I could tell. I didn't find that interesting, and I'm not a great memorizer, so I find memorizing boring, and I'm not very good at it and don't like it. So I think that was it. I just liked physics a lot more because I found it really easy to remember the physics, because it was about you had to understand something and then it was obvious. Whereas the biology, I had to memorize stuff and I just found it boring. Probably simple as that. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a common critique, I think, of science in general, right? I think Tom McLeish has found a lot of students complaining to him that, I didn't find in science any room for creativity, because it was for a lot of them sort of just rote memorization. I think my own experience of science was like that growing up. And I'm glad that you found physics to be more compelling.
Actually, if I was king of the world, I would take science curricula in secondary schools and in universities and cut down the subject matter by at least a factor of 2, if not 4, and teach you a lot less knowledge and a lot more about how to think. And I think if I could do that, you'd learn a lot more. I remember I actually did my PhD in the US, where they do, well, you know this because you live in the US, but there students do these pre-med courses, and physics is one of the weeder courses. So when I was at Cornell, I was a teaching assistant in this physics, and they taught them huge amounts of stuff that they had to know. And the students just memorized it, got past their exams, and it just drove me completely batty. Because I thought, these are going to be doctors. They don't need to know the names of all these things, but they do need know how to think about data. They do need to learn to think about uncertainty and when can you trust something and when not. They need to learn how to take a theoretical framework and see whether it applies to what they're observing. And if it isn't, to understand whether it's an experimental error or whether actually they discover something new. These are skills that a doctor needs. And they don't need to know Ohm's law. And they can also look it up later if they want to, right? So don't get me started on this. So I think it's obviously people's minds work very differently, and I've just never found that kind of memorization interesting. So that's part of the reason for my kind of dislike of that type of teaching. But I think, like I'm giving you the pre-med example, I think there's something there that we're missing an opportunity by trying to cram a lot of data in, and by kind of teaching to the test, as it were. It's not good for people.
Well, tell me about the work you do now, and what could you, if you could say a little bit about what your area of research is, just for a layperson, and something that a layperson might understand, and then where do you encounter beauty in the work that you do? So,
very roughly speaking, physics divides in different categories. So there's people who do experiments, which means they try to measure things. And people do theories. That means they try to calculate things. And I'm a theorist, so I calculate stuff. My lab, as it were, is a bunch of students sitting around a computer or with a piece of paper, or actually often just on a blackboard. And then if I have a good theory that can be tested by experiments, or I might look at a bunch of experiments that are not understood and try to write a mathematical theory that will explain them. And then the other way that physics kind of divides is between people that are interested in, very big things like astrophysics, or very small things like particles. And then the other side, there are people like myself who are interested in emergent phenomenon, which is a fancy word for saying, how do many individual things generate something bigger than themselves? So how is the whole more than the sum of the parts? So a classic example of this thinking would be water and wetness, right? So we know water is H2O, it's a molecule, but one molecule isn't wet, 2 molecules aren't wet, 3 aren't wet. But if you put a lot of them together, this phenomenon of wetness emerges, right? So it's not there in the molecule, it's in the relationships between the molecules. And so that's the field that I'm interested in. It's a very broad set of ideas you can apply that to. So I have some, if I could understand, the idea would be if I can understand how 2 water molecules and then a lot of them interact, then I might understand a concept like wetness. So I've applied that to a wide range of topics, and currently I'm interested in 3 things in my lab. One of them is self-assembly, so things that make themselves. So your body is full of amazing machinery. For example, there are little motors that turn at, say, 100,000 RPM. There's little walkers that walk along tracks. It's absolutely extraordinary. If you were to see these things, if they were big, so you could hold them in your hand, you'd know they'd be made in a factory. So there'd be some kind of assembly line that puts them together. But these things actually make themselves. That's to say, in your body, they float around, like little proteins, little units float around, and they stick together. They self-assemble into these really extraordinary things. So I'm interested in the mathematical properties of that. Like, how does that work? It's like taking Lego blocks, okay? You put them into a box, you add some glue, you shake it, and out comes like a fully formed train.
Right.
Right now, that's what nature does all the time, and we'd like to understand it. What I know is if I put some glue on Lego blocks and I shake it, I just get junk. Because the vast majority of ways I can stick things together is not something interesting, it's just junk. The number of interesting things are quite a limited number of those. And so the question is, how does nature do it? It's super interesting. So I've been interested in that problem and applying kind of these emergent ideas to say, what is it about these things coming together that makes them suddenly self-organize and make these really exquisitely well-defined shapes? And then I got interested in, that's what I started working on for the last 10 years ago, and I've been working on that ever since. I got a big program on it, kind of ticking things over. And then I got interested in the second question, which is, well, a lot of these biological machines evolved. That is to say, they're the product of an evolutionary process, which is stochastic. So it means random mutations happen to make these things stick or not stick. And that's even more kind of crazy. You think, well, it's one thing for these things to self-assemble. It's another thing for a random process to design things that self-assemble so beautifully. So I got very interested in this question. So I got interested in evolution. And so I've been thinking about evolution ever since. And that's a lot of my recent work has been linked to evolution. And then more recently, I won't talk about it too much today, I've been interested in machine learning, so AI. A lot of modern AI, the big kind of AI revolution of the last 10 years has been based around what are called neural networks, which are machines loosely based on our brain. So you give them data and they learn. They kind of teach themselves how to solve a problem. And it turns out, I think, that the mathematical ideas I've been developing for evolution actually also work for these neural networks. So I've got like another side where I'm trying to think about why neural networks work so well. And you might think, why is somebody working on self-assembly, evolution, and neural networks? Well, because they're all linked together, it turns out, in a mathematical way. They all have the same mathematical principles underlying them. And I'm exploring those.
That's fantastic. Tell me, are there moments in your career where you've encountered something profoundly beautiful in your research?
Yeah, so I think many times, I think I've seen many things. When I first discovered that there are these self-assembling machines, which is not something I discovered, it's well known, I just thought that was exquisitely beautiful. In fact, interestingly, what got me motivated to work on that was a video by a Japanese researcher called Keiji Namba, who had a giant research grant from the Japanese government. There's a period when they were giving out these absolutely enormous grants. And so this is probably about 10, 15 years ago. He paid something like $100,000 to make an animation of the self-assembly of the bacterial flagellar motor. You can go online, you can find this. Very pretty. You can see these things coming together. And it was basically informed guess of how we think this thing assembles. And I saw the video and I thought, wow, that's mind-blowing. Right? It's very beautiful that nature can achieve this. And so I thought, I need to understand, like, how does this work? Right? This can't possibly, you got to look at this and think, this can't possibly be true. But yet it obviously is, because it happens in our bodies all the time, billions and millions and billions of times. So it works. It just it seems really weird. And so I found that very beautiful. And then my first step into this is I looked at virus self-assembles, little viruses that form themselves into well-defined shapes. And that's just very extraordinarily beautiful. And it worked. So the first time that my student came, I had a very excitable student who came bouncing into my office saying, look, it works. And we designed these little particles, we made them move randomly. And no matter, every time we started them from a random configuration, they would nevertheless assemble at exactly the same shape each time. So we knew we had at least, cracked something there. And it was very extraordinary. Yeah.
What about that was beautiful for you? Is it the fact that these things exist in nature, or that you can grasp the workings of these mechanisms, or?
Well, so, yeah, exactly. I think when scientists talk about beauty, I think it's actually a catchword for quite a set of different concepts. So there is a beauty in what you might observe under a microscope, or what you might see. And, my father is a plant specialist. So his specialty is the tropical rainforests. And one of his things he would do, he's a generalist, so he does the rainforest as a whole, and they go looking for new species. And so he would often he'd have these teams of scientists who would go with him into the jungle for, a few months. At a time, they kind of Indiana Jones like living out there. And each of these people would be specialized in some kind of plant. I remember this man who was a begonia specialist. And we used to have a running joke, how quickly could he take any conversation and turn it into begonias? And it's usually about 2 sentences, and he could turn it, it was about, and then off we'd go, right? And so, I think begonias are pretty, but for him, this is it was the most amazing thing in the world. So there's a sense that the more you know about something, often, and you see the intricacies of it, it can be very aesthetically attractive and very beautiful. And I think begonias are pretty as well, typically. But he would see more than the beauty that I would see as a kind of lay person. He would see something, the beauty of all kinds of details of how it was put together, and was very obsessed by it. So there's that kind of observational beauty. I think there's also a sense of beauty you get when you figure out how something works for the first time. And we call it beauty, I think for lack of a better word, it's not beauty in the kind of aesthetic sense you get when you look at a picture. It's beauty in the sense of you suddenly realize how things hang together. And it's very exciting. mean, you've probably thought about this more than I have, but we did a little documentary series called Why Are We Here, where we looked at beauty and questions about beauty, and another word that people started talking about was the sublime, which is a word that captures maybe something about awe. So beauty might be something you see that's very pretty. The sublime might be the kind of experience you have on the top of a mountain, and you look down and you realize how high up you are and how big it is. And so it has a sense of awe and mystery.
The vastness of things.
Vastness of it, yeah. Or you feel like you're touching something that, you're the first person to see, the first person to touch, something beyond yourself. And I think that's the sense that you get when you understand something for the first time. So like the first time we understood something about how these self-assembling viruses worked, I had that more sublime sense, like, okay, that's what they do. And I felt like a veil had been lifted. And so I call it beautiful, but I might mean it's probably more like the sublime. It's a slightly different thing. And I think we haven't really got a good vocabulary for those different senses of beauty.
It's those things coming together. You get access into the workings of reality or the inner logic of things, or...
Yeah, exactly. You get access to suddenly you feel like something has been shown to you that maybe you almost feel like, maybe I wasn't even supposed to see that. So, yeah, and so that's the kind of sense of the sublime. And I've talked to scientists who say, when they first see that, they get goosebumps, or they get this sense of, that's incredible. And interestingly, if you talk to people listening to music, occasionally they'll say, this music gave me goosebumps, which is not always the same as it's beautiful. It's more like something more like the sublime, like, oh, this music seemed to transport me beyond myself in a way that I didn't expect, or it touched on I didn't realize that was possible. So I think that when we talk about beauty, we really talk about there are different ways of thinking about it, and different kinds of emotive responses to different aspects of something which is much bigger than just, say, pretty.
Yeah. So sure. So there's the prettiness of, or I suppose even the symmetry or elegance of equations is one kind of beauty, and then there's the kind of ability to use those things as heuristics, perhaps. But you're talking about this other kind of beauty where it's that insight, that the beauty of understanding or a recognition of how things work. Tell me, you've recently published this paper, a really important paper in PNAS, that claims that nature prefers symmetry. Can you unpack that for us? I mean, what led you to this project, and what did you find? What does it mean?
Yeah, so this is a project I'm working on for quite a long time. It was inspired by this question of how do these self-assembling systems work? How could you just randomly change interactions between things? How could you take a bunch of Lego blocks, randomly put glue down, and have it suddenly actually make something that works? And so I started thinking about, what does evolution do? And evolution has really two steps. So first, there are mutations, or some kind of way that your genes are, your genotype, so your genetic material gets scrambled, gets changed. And then you get what people call the phenotype, which is the physical manifestation of that change. So that's some property of the physical object. But, DNA is not a blueprint, like a blueprint of a house. It's really like a recipe book, right? And the recipe is not the dish. So once you realize that some kind of process has to take that information, process it, and turn it into an output. So then I started thinking about, well, what's the simplest example we have of processing systems? They're actually computer programs, right? And so I thought, well, this step of evolution, this first step, which is generating new variation, is a little bit like randomly typing onto a computer program and then seeing what comes out. Once the phenotype exists in the population, then natural selection may select for it or not select for it, depending on whether it increases fitness. But that first step is really interesting. It kind of tells you what can happen. And then there's a very deep set of mathematical principles in theoretical computer science that tell us that if you just randomly type programs in, you might accidentally, for example, type a program like print 01 500 times, right? That's a short program, but it'll generate a sequence of length 1,000 01s, right? So what that tells you is if you type into some kind of programming language, which is what the biology does, it randomly changes the genotypes, but the genotypes are not the outputs. These outputs get translated by some abstract language that I may or may not know. The argument is, if I look at the other side, I'm much more likely to see things that have short descriptions than things that have long descriptions. Because if I randomly type, I'm unlikely to type a correct program that's long, but I might accidentally type a correct program that's short. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, so you're more likely to type short programs than long programs that are correct. And you can then measure that. And then, so what I'm really saying is simple things, by which I mean things that have short descriptions, are more likely to come out of evolutionary processes than complicated things. And symmetry is actually quite simple. So if I want to make a complex, so we looked at protein complexes. Proteins are the molecular workhorses of your cell. Your cells are full of these proteins, and they form all these molecular machines are made of proteins. So 2 of them make a dimer, 3 of them make a trimer, 4 of them make a tetramer, etc. And so you can look at tetramers or hexamers, sexmers, and you'll see that lots of them are symmetric. Now, it turns out that if you think about this as this kind of algorithmic process, what's happening is you're randomly adding and subtracting things on these proteins. If you want to make a certain shape, it's much easier to say, make this pattern and repeat it a bunch of times than it is to say, to actually specify where every single object goes. Right? So my print 0, 1, 500 times is like a symmetric description. I say something and then repeat it. Right? So the intuition is, since symmetric things have shorter descriptions than unsymmetric things, if I just randomly search in the space of algorithms, I'm going to first find the symmetric algorithms, the ones that make symmetric things, before I find the asymmetric ones. In fact, we can mathematically prove that for every extra bit of information I need to describe the process, I drop the likelihood of getting it by a factor of 2. So it's a very nice, beautiful law. And so what we did is we applied this law to protein complexes and showed that this explains the frequency with which you find them in nature. So people used to think, there's lots of symmetric clusters in nature because somehow symmetry gives you some advantage. We're saying, actually, it's simpler. It turns out that if you remember that you're searching in the space of the algorithms rather than search in the space of shapes, then you're much more likely to make something symmetric than something that's not symmetric. And what we see, so what we then basically, we show this in some theoretical models, then we show it for real proteins, and for RNA, and for every other molecules. And this explains patterns of nature extremely nicely without having to worry about natural selection at all. It's not that natural selection isn't working. It's just that the reason for the symmetry is not natural selection, but the fact that symmetric things are easier to make. So it's as simple as that. So that's the argument. So it's an algorithmic argument. At very, very high level, we're saying, just remember, evolution is searching in the space of algorithms, not in the space of shapes. That's how it does stuff. And once you realize that, it kind of opens up a very different way of thinking about what evolution is doing. And symmetry is just one of the consequences of that.
How do things like considerations of, say, efficiency or elegance tie in? Because it seems like a shorter program is also perhaps a more elegant program, right?
Yeah, so those are things that we're still thinking through. So, but there is an interesting link to Occam's razor, which I think, so Occam's razor is an idea that simpler descriptions are better. If you've got multiple descriptions, pick the simplest one. And so this is saying that evolution is basically picking the simpler algorithms rather than the more complex ones. And we often think of simple descriptions as being more elegant somehow. So it does link together. It's like nature has an automatic elegance builder in there. If you ask me what I think is elegant about the story is that these very abstract ideas from theory of computer science have been around for a long time and have been, linked to a very different part of mathematics suddenly apply to life. That's the elegant part of it. That's not the same as saying nature. Well, nature does seem to prefer more elegant solutions in these systems than you might otherwise expect, and that's just built into the nature of the way evolution works. I mean, it's quite a radical idea. Okay, this goes against the way that you're normally taught, and so I always recognize that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and so we're still thinking through how far up the complexity chain these principles work.
But your finding is that symmetry seems to occur much more frequently, significantly more frequently than you would expect, right? Is that?
Well, so we know that symmetry is more frequent.
Right.
And so the question is why?
Yeah? Okay.
And the traditional way of thinking about that, there must be some selective advantage to it. So nature must try different shapes and see if the symmetric one ends up giving higher fitness. And what we're saying is actually no. The symmetric shapes are the first ones to appear. And as long as the symmetric shape is good enough to do the job, nature's going to pick a symmetric shape over an asymmetric shape.
Okay, so which then raises questions as to how to explain all the asymmetry, right, that we find.
Yeah.
I know there's some physicists who have, I suppose, talked about maybe the bias toward symmetry in a different sense, perhaps the bias toward symmetry in theory, where there's a preference for more symmetrical theories. People like Marcelo Gleiser, I think, have argued that we should pay more attention to asymmetry, and because asymmetry is so vital for, say, time, or just even our existence in the universe, right? I mean, I think if we had the symmetry we would expect, then there would be equal amounts of matter and antimatter and so forth, and that doesn't seem to be the case. So what do you think is the sort of role of asymmetry in nature, and then in your argument as well? How does that relate to your finding about algorithms?
Actually, if you look very closely at these protein complexes that we mentioned, they're all actually not perfectly symmetric, but slightly asymmetric. And there's some kind of more detailed reasons for why that is. And that's to do with the fact that if you make it perfectly symmetric, the bonds have a hard time satisfying themselves. So what happens is you go for the symmetric shape, and then it kind of just twists a little bit away from symmetry. And so what we're saying in that case is you've got almost symmetry and then a little twist away from it. But it's still true that at its core, evolution is going to the symmetric, finding the symmetric solutions and then deviating from it a little bit. Then in physics, we've got a very important concept called symmetry breaking, where you look at a system, you find it has a symmetry, and then you see that nature often breaks the symmetry, so it goes one way or the other way. And these are very important for biological molecules. If you just make them in your laboratory, there can be 50-50 different chiralities, left-handed and right-handed, whereas nature just uses one kind of the two. And so they're left-handed ones. And so there's some kind of breaking of the symmetry there that was important. So I think there's something actually very beautiful about that as well, because you only can really think about the breaking of symmetry if you start from something that's symmetric. And it's important to remember that the number of asymmetric shapes you can make is always much, much larger than the number of symmetric shapes. There's only a few symmetric shapes and many asymmetric ones. And so the kind of asymmetry that physicists often look at, or biologists looking at, are often small deviations from symmetry or breakings of symmetry. Right? You're still thinking about a very small subset of the space of all possibilities. And that still gives you, actually, there's kind of an aesthetics in the imperfection that's there as well.
Well, that's fascinating. You're listening to Beauty at Work. Another aspect of beauty I wanted to ask you about is the way in which beauty can either be helpful in theorizing or a liability. And so here I'm thinking about folks like Sabine Hassenfelder, who've argued that beauty has been leading physics astray, the pursuit of, say, beautiful equations and so on. Do you find this sort of, I'm just curious to know what you think of this. Do you find beauty as useful as a heuristic in your work, or do you find it, perhaps potentially misleading? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think that the problem is that when we talk about beauty, we often mean slightly different things. And so I remember there's a very famous physicist and then theologian who passed away a few years ago, John Polkinghorne, who was a student of Paul Dirac, who's one of the great exponents of beauty in science. And Polkinghorne once said, we recognize beauty when we see it. And although it's hard to define among physicists, he was a theoretical particle physicist, you kind of see it, you recognize it when you see it. So one of the issues there is that what Polkinghorne and other great theoretical physicists saw or understood is something that they've learned over time to recognize as being a sign of a good theory. Now, it's interesting that in the whole kind of history, the 20th century history of modern physics, oftentimes the solutions that ended up being successful were remarkably beautiful in the sense that they were very simple, often had high symmetries to them. And so one of the things that then happened is people started using this idea to go further and further. Perhaps the most famous example was Paul Dirac. So Dirac, in 1928, published a very famous paper where he looked at quantum mechanics, which is a theory of very small things. So it's Schrodinger's equation had just come out in 1926. It's a theory of small things, like electrons. And then connected that with special relativity, Einstein's special relativity, which is a theory of very fast things, from 1905. And he asks a very simple question. I have a small thing that also goes fast. Okay, what will the equation look like? I know two different things that it has to, two different limits that it has to satisfy. It turns out that if you take an electron and you try to make it obey the laws of Einstein, so-called Lorentz invariant, it's a symmetry that it needs to obey, that the only way you can make the equations obey that is by adding another particle to the equation. So that mathematics doesn't allow you to have an electron that does that without adding this extra object. And so he, being very mathematically oriented physicist, just published it, even though it seems strange. And he later says that he just believed that particle was there. And a few years later, 1931, 1932, Carl Anderson at Caltech discovered the positron, which is the antimatter partner of the electron. And in that way, antimatter, just this really crazy thing, if you take, it's the opposite of matter. You take electron and a positron, you put them together, they annihilate into energy. So it's E is mc squared. The m from the two particles becomes E. We now use it in PET scans, positron emission tomography. So you go to a hospital, you can get these, they can use positrons. But they're a really crazy thing. And they were discovered in some sense by mathematical elegance, or the mathematics kind of imposed this on us. I remember as an undergraduate learning about this and thinking, well, this can't possibly be true. How could two completely disparate ideas, quantum mechanics and special relativity, put them together, and the only way you can make it work mathematically is if you have this other kind of object. So that's an amazing success of just our minds. It's an amazing success of what people call the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics. And that success was then repeated many times in discovering other particles, all the way to we get what we now have the Standard Model, which is a model of all the particles that we've currently ever seen. And the Higgs boson was the most recent one that was found, but nobody doubted that it was there because it had to be there, because that pattern has just been repeated many times. And so what Sabine is trying to say is, well, how do you know that success is going to continue on if you try to go, because we 90% of our universe, we don't know what it's made of. It's dark matter. We've got gravity, which is a classical theory, and these quantum theories, we have no idea how to bring these together. And the problem is we're not getting experiments at the moment that are showing us where to go. And in that vacuum, what a lot of my colleagues in theoretical physics are saying is, well, we're going to take this Diracian approach, which is let's posit some kind of symmetry, and they take the mathematics and let's see what it tells us. And we're going to just do that again and again and again until we find something that works. And Sabine is saying, well, this is, to be honest, this is a process that's been going on for a long time. So I think the Higgs boson was predicted by Higgs more than 50 years ago. So that's a long time to not have, a new particle that we can find. And so it's perfectly reasonable to say, well, how do you know that this methodology is going to keep working? We don't know. Right? It was astoundingly successful. It predicted antimatter out of nothing, like fell from the sky. It's completely amazing. And that is very beautiful. So I often say the Dirac equation is as beautiful as the most amazing piece of music or the most amazing mountain range. It's as a piece of something extraordinary. It's beautiful both in the kind of sense of the sublime, because you just wonder, how can I see something about nature? And it's actually aesthetically beautiful because the equations are very simple. They have kind of symmetries to them. They're extremely elegant. So it's beautiful on many different levels. And it's obviously beautiful and amazing because it was so successful. But, the fact is, we don't know why that methodology is successful. We don't know why we have this unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics. Obviously, it's worked really well in the past. But maybe if we're not careful, it's constraining us from some very creative idea. So that would be, I think it's, yeah. The pushback that Sabine gets from my colleagues is to say, fine. Show me what your new idea is then that's going to be better.
Right. What's the alternative to relying on?
We're totally happy for you to critique us, fine, okay. But then show us what we should do instead. And that's where it's a bit problematic because nobody knows what else to do.
Right. I suppose if you're going to posit a hypothesis, you may as well go with one that's more beautiful than, I don't know if that's, because there isn't another criterion for.
Yeah, when these physicists, when they say they're using beauty as a guide, they really mean something more subtle than just aesthetics. What they mean is we're going to look for structures of mathematics because these structures of mathematics have explained to us where all these particles come from. So there's these symmetries groups, basically, and they have a certain number of objects in them, and then those are exactly the particles that you find. And in Dirac's case, there's a particular symmetry that he put in there, and that's what dropped this out. And so you can generalize these ideas again and again and again. And so that's what they're trying to do. So basically, the beauty is that deep mathematical structures, often discovered by mathematicians in a completely different context, turn out to somehow impose their will on the physical world and allow us to see things that end up being true. And so the modern physics, my string theory colleagues particularly, are just pushing that same idea further and further and further. And so when Sabine says we should look at beauty, what she's really saying we shouldn't be looking for mathematical structures that the universe will then follow. And then the question then is, okay, what are you going to do then? And this is really hard to know.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose it links to the other critiques of things like string theory, right? I think of people like Jim Baggott who complain this is fairy tale physics, or it's, Peter Voigt who says it's not even wrong. So because these are things that, some of these things are in principle untestable experimentally, right? And so, you watch Michio Kaku, describe wormholes or something, and you say, well, what is science and what is science fiction? And so I wonder, what do you think? Yeah.
So exactly. So Michio Kaku and others like that, they do engage in, I think, probably science fiction in some sense or the other. They're popularizers, and obviously this is very attractive. It's very fun to think about. It's unclear how much of this is true. So I think there's a very interesting kind of question about the nature of science that happens when you start looking at these things that are untestable. And even people like John Polkinghorne is a good example of an older generation of scientists that looked at this and that use these aesthetic arguments. And what they always say is, yes, we use the aesthetic arguments, but we also did lots of experiments, which between several aesthetic arguments decided which one was the best one.
Right.
And now in string theory, we don't longer have that empirical data to decide. So what are we doing then? And there's been a very interesting kind of move by philosophers to look at what they call philosophy of cosmology, which is basically saying, well, if you're not doing experiments, then maybe what you're doing is something more similar to philosophy. Philosophy has its own kind of internal rules about how to find something that's true or not true. So if you're a logician, that's pretty well defined how and so perhaps what these string theorists should do is to go look at philosophers and talk to them and see if they can find some other criteria on which to adjudicate between what's right and what's wrong. And I don't think it's gotten that far yet, but the idea is that if you can no longer empirically test, right, then you're actually doing something that's more akin to philosophy.
Right. It's
or maybe than something
somehow
else.
Beyond the boundaries of science, or
it's beyond the boundaries of what we normally think of as empirical science. But there's an interesting kind of counter to this. Like this, physicists, particularly theoretical physicists like myself, really believe in the power of mathematics to tell us truths about the world. Right? So what I just told you, I took this abstract mathematical theory called algorithmic information theory. It's based on universal Turing machines. It's actually very closely linked to Gödel's undecidability theorem, so deep kind of questions in fundamental mathematics. And I applied it to maps from genotypes to phenotypes, and I think this must tell you how the world is. It's a physicist approach. I believe in that the math tells me that you should have this bias towards simple structures, and then I go looking for it, and I'm not surprised that I find it. That's a classic, it's a deductive argument. There's a really interesting book by Evelyn Fox Keller, who's a physicist, and then she's now an emerita philosopher at MIT. And it's called Making Sense of Life, Models, Metaphors, and Machines. And she talks about the time when she moved from physics to biology. In the preface, she has a really fascinating story. She's teaching a bunch of medical students about dimensional analysis, which physicists and engineers think is extremely simple. It's something like if you have a velocity, which is meters per second, and you've got something which is the length, and then you know there's a time in there as well, because you've got a length and a time and a velocity. So it's basically just saying, like, these are these dimensions. And so we don't think there's anything experimental about this. It's just something about the world. And so a student raised his hand in her class and says, "Excuse me, ma'am, how do you know that's true? Have you done the experiment?" And she was flabbergasted, because why would you do an experiment to describe something which is logically true? And then the book, she basically says she realized that for these biologists that she was teaching, deductive arguments are a lot less reliable, because nature surprises us all the time. We think that we have all the assumptions lined up, but there may be a premise that we didn't realize that was wrong, or something else that comes in as surprise. And so therefore, in biological sciences, these theoretical arguments like the one I just gave you are just not trusted nearly the way they're trusted in physics. And I think there's for good empirical reasons, because there's been many biological theories that have turned out to be wrong, because there was something tricky that the biological system was doing that we just didn't realize. Whereas in physics, we've got things much more under control. Like physics experiments are in some sense much simpler than biological experiments. And physics in some sense distinguishes itself by having problems where you can't control everything really well. And then it is a deductive argument. Once I know all the premises, it's just a question of, am I smart enough to grind it through and to figure out what it does? But in biology, the problem is there is always a premise that I might have, that might be wrong. And so so you see actually really strong differences, and this is of course across this, even within biology or within physics, differences in how communities find truth and how much they rely on theoretical arguments to do so. When you start in a particular subfield, you're kind of apprenticed to your PhD supervisor and your postdoc supervisor, etc. And they kind of teach you these subtle things, like when do you trust something and when do you not? And I've learned working with biologists that, for example, for them, learning how experiments are always, they're never quite sure whether the experiment is true or not. They'll go, yeah, maybe true, maybe not true. Think about this, think about that, in a way that physicists don't worry about in the same way. And so I've had to learn to do my biological theorizing, which I might take some data and try to explain it. I have to talk to some biologists first, because they might say, well, that data says that, but maybe it's not quite right. Maybe this effect or that effect might be
much
happening.
More contingency and complexity.
Much more contingency in there, because these the subject matter is infinitely more complex.
Yeah.
So that gives you very different local cultures. So different ways of weaving. So whenever you do science, it's never linear, right? It's always a whole series of things that you weave together in kind of a tapestry, right? And how you form that tapestry, so what you consider to be a strong tapestry or a weak tapestry, a lot of those are kind of not often the subconscious norms that a field takes on. And they do that based on experience and based on a number of things that tell them, theoretical arguments are very powerful, which is what theoretical physicists think, or theoretical arguments are interesting but shouldn't be trusted, which is what biologists typically think, and everything in between.
Fantastic.
And so one of the fascinating questions is, you've now had this long experience of Dirackian success of these theoretical arguments, and that culture is very deeply entrenched in physics, and so we're pushing it forward. So it's good to have people like Sabine say, wait a minute, how do you know that's still true?
Or how this particular, are there different sorts of aesthetic sensibilities that might approach something differently? I mean, so, one of the, I think, classic worries sort of reflects this sort of concern that, say around the time of Kepler, the preference was for celestial objects being spherical, and then the ellipse, didn't quite meet that criterion, and then it took some time to actually adjust, because one was locked into a problematic aesthetic. And are we similarly trapped in some aesthetic standard right now that we're not really able to progress out of because we're kind of locked into?
Yeah, the Kepler story is interesting, because it wasn't, I don't think, as much aesthetics as Aristotelian ideas about heavenly spheres and earthly spheres, right? So in the earthly spheres, you have irregular motion. The heavenly sphere, you have spherical motion. That wasn't just an aesthetic argument. That was an Aristotelian argument, and with the kind of rediscovery of Aristotle, that got theologized into the church even, which made that harder to think through. Interestingly, if you look at Kepler, so Ptolemy then came up with epicycles. So you had so the problem is, it's not quite a circle. So you make circles and circles, circles and circles and circles. And the question then is, why did, at some point, Kepler come up with this idea of ellipses, right? He wasn't able to actually describe anything that you couldn't do with the Ptolemaic system, but it was more elegant. And it looks like that played an argument for him in believing that this was probably to be true. And that it's an interesting debate in the literature about how much this kind of Occam's razor-like argument for simplicity a theoretical preference for simplicity played a role in Kepler and his followers of believing that this must be true. It wasn't observational. It wasn't like they had observations that clearly knocked the other model out of the water. It was that basically it was aesthetically better. And so the important thing is, I think, that, yes, so in Aristotle's metaphysics, the heavenly sphere was circular for various reasons. But I think you could probably say that Kepler thought that taking just the ellipses, which suddenly hugely simplified the problem, was more beautiful. And probably, we don't know, because I don't think they wrote about things in that sense, but well, maybe they did actually. But beauty, I think, almost certainly played a role in his preference for his elliptical orbits. And the beauty there is not the fact that the ellipse is less or more beautiful than the circle, but the fact that you just need a small number of ellipses to describe everything, as opposed to
circles upon circles, right?
Huge number of cycles.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you about, just the significance or meaning of our ability to encounter beauty in scientific theories. So I think of someone like Frank Wilczek, who argues that nature embodies beautiful ideas, or that we can even see nature as a work of art. That our ability to find this sort of beauty as, human beings, or these like evolutionarily sort of random entities on this little planet that's sort of nowhere in the universe, and being capable of grasping the inner logics of the entire universe, and not only grasping it, but finding it beautiful. What does that imply to you as a scientist, or does it point to anything? Does it have any significance?
It's definitely amazing. And so I think I'm thinking back to my example of Dirac. You can't understand that for the first time and not just feel awe and the sense of the sublime, the same kind of sense you have when you climb a mountain, suddenly you look down, you see thousands of meters below you, and that sense of wow. So I think there's a sense of the sublime, which I think is shared by many people in science. Certainly for religious scientists like myself, Christian scientists, there's a sense of this is somehow linked to our sense of God. So you look at that, and almost all my friends in physics who are Christians will say, oh, when I make this kind of discovery, or I see something what I think is very beautiful, very pleasing, or very awe-inspiring, I have a sense of worship, that I'm touching on something bigger than myself. And interestingly, if you talk to people about religious experience, then going into the mountains and seeing something really grand can often be, for people's sense, pointed to the divine. Now, very famously in the Bible, in the Psalms, it says, I look at the stars, what is man that you are mindful of him? Right? So the sense of you look at the stars and they seem very grand, and makes you feel like there's something bigger than yourself out there. So I think what our microscopes and our telescopes and our equations do is only to amplify that sentiment. And so I would say a sense of awe. And I think, you can push this argument further and say, well, okay, you might expect on theism that something like this would be true, that God would make an orderly world that was therefore understandable or tractable. And certainly in the history of science, that sentiment played an important role in the development of modern science. The idea that if there is a God, the world is not capricious, right? There are laws that are there to be discovered, and that we can look at them and get some kind of sense of truth. I think that the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics to allow us to understand quantum mechanics, or to discover antimatter on basically mathematical grounds, feels like kind of amplification of that idea. And certainly, I see it as the same kind of pointer to God that I would if I see something very beautiful outside. But I recognize that that's a pretty, it's a hard argument to completely tie down. Yeah. But I do think, as a religious person, these can be almost spiritual-like experiences.
Yeah, we do find, at least in our survey data on scientists, that those who consider themselves more spiritually inclined also report experiencing awe more often in their scientific work. There's a very strong correlation.
That's interesting. Definitely, people feel awe, and Richard Dawkins writes about this himself. He's obviously not religious. Although, interestingly, when you read his stuff, he has a kind of religious tone to him, even in his kind of atheology, I call it. Right? So it has it's a kind of religious innocence. And so maybe it's interesting to ask yourself whether this is something that we're trained to do as religious scientists, or whether there's some aspect of our personalities that makes us more open to those things. But surely, I would say if I talk to I've got a lot of colleagues here in physics who are Christians. For some reason, there's lots of us in Oxford physics who are Christians, and we meet together and talk about these things. And the sense that we find something in our science that points us towards God is almost universal. and it's often something about the beauty of it, or the way it's beautifully organized and beautifully, like the idea there's a lawgiver behind there, and you're discovering these laws, and they're very beautiful laws, and you think, well, if there's just naturalism, then why would those laws be beautiful and elegant? Why would they not just be kind of random? And why can we understand them? Why are they intelligible? That seems rather surprising. Surely if we just evolved, if you a crude argument, and there are sophisticated arguments of this evolutionary argument against naturalism by Plantinga and other versions of it. Sharon Street has a version against moral realism, but basic idea is, there's a whole kind of branch of evolutionary debunking arguments, philosophers call them. But the idea is basically, if you evolve on the African savannah to survive, then you can see why that higher good better cognition might help you do so. But it's surprising that you can then understand Dirac's derivation, or the Dirac-Cadu's derivation, because it's not so clear. That's so far removed from anything that would generate a survival.
Yeah, any kind of evolutionary advantage. I mean, unless you want to say we're sort of we have to adapt by somehow colonizing all the planets and move to,
in the future. But evolution doesn't look in the future, right?
That's right. Yes.
I think these are difficult. Yeah. So the argument might be that our ability to understand mathematics and to therefore peer into the world so deeply is maybe some maybe some side effects that happens. Some misfiring of our genes. But I don't think so. That's not. I think these are signs of the divine somehow. But I hold that lightly. I think there are signs of the divine, but I don't think that necessarily somebody who doesn't share my premises or my priors will necessarily see them in the same way. And that's fine.
Let me ask a final question. Why should the public care about whether there's beauty in science or what scientists find beautiful, particularly the kind of work you're doing, for instance? Can experiencing the kind of awe and beauty that you find in science be helpful, say, to improve public trust in science or in scientists? Is the beauty that you experience sort of intrinsically valuable, even if it, say, doesn't lead to some useful outcome for the public? What do you think there?
Well, I think that question can be answered in several different ways. One way is that scientific work can be hard. You can be stuck for a long time with no results. You need grit and perseverance and dedication to go forward. Clearly, science has dramatically improved our lives, and that is a testament to many people who spent their lives or their careers dedicated to some small, tiny aspect of it, and have somehow lifted a veil that's allowed us to, solve disease or have better technology or do many things. And many of the greatest discoveries we've made have come from this kind of curiosity-driven, beauty-driven research, out-of-the-box thinking. It's very important that we allow that in our society, because on a long term, this is where the really great breakthroughs tend to come from. And so those kind of breakthroughs, when people talk about curiosity-driven research, blue sky research, they're often actually talking about beauty-led research. You're looking for something beautiful, something attractive. So that's one reason why society should care about it, whether they know that that's true or not. It's a motivator, and it's a driver of future innovation. But I think, just like if you find something that's very beautiful, you want to show it to people. You want them to share your joy. So I like talking about science to lay people. I like to try to explain it to them in a way that they might think this is cool and interesting. I don't expect them to understand every detail of it, but I do want them to grasp that this is something really cool and fun, just on the principle this is a good thing to do. And there's another reason for that, is that, my salary is paid by the British taxpayer. So that's people that I meet they're paying me effectively. And so I think I have some responsibility to let them know what the fruits of my labor are. And so I think that's another reason why I might want to share this. And if I want to share it in a way that they will find interesting, and beauty is part of that. So interesting, my paper on symmetry that got huge amounts of press, a lot of lay people are very interested in this, because they recognize that symmetry is beautiful. They think of evolution as being a random process, and therefore doesn't generate beauty. So it seemed very strange that these two things would come together. And I think I'm very happy telling people, hey, look, maybe evolution is much more beautiful than you realized. Maybe randomness can actually generate this symmetric beauty, and isn't that cool? And I think if I can give somebody that kind of, just like that kind of thing, some kind of hint of something interesting, it makes their lives better. And hopefully it'll also encourage younger people to go into science, have a very bright new person that looks at this and thinks, oh yeah, I would like to do that.
Fantastic. Ard, thank you so much. This has been really insightful. I've learned a lot, really delightful. So thank you so much for taking the time again.
Well, thank you. It was really fun to talk to you. These are really fun questions.
Yeah. So I'll ask you for some resources that we can share with our audience, and we'll put that up on our show notes, and they can read more about your work. And thank you again. Yeah, and the great ideas we've talked about. Hey everyone, thanks for listening to this episode of Beauty at Work. Please be sure to check out the show notes for more resources from our guest. I hope you really enjoyed this episode. If you like the show, please be sure to share this episode with your friends. And also please subscribe to our podcast and leave us a 5-star review. It really helps us out. Music for this show was provided by Venkat Subramaniam, and the podcast was edited by Dave Visaya from Podcast Engineers. This season of Beauty at Work is sponsored by Templeton Religion Trust as part of a grant on the aesthetic dimensions of science. To learn more about this project, please visit wellbeinginscience.com. Also, for the broader project on Beauty at Work, please visit beautyatwork.net.